I never told my son how much I really made. He's 34 now. Married. Settled in a shiny condo downtown. To him, I've always been just Mom. The quiet woman in old cardigans. Living in a small apartment near Lakeview East. Drinking instant coffee. Walking to work with the same tote bag I've carried for 10 years. He thinks I'm ordinary. And that's exactly how I wanted it. But a few weeks ago, something changed. It started with a phone call. One of those short, polite calls that hide something heavier beneath the surface. Mom Danny's voice came through the line. Careful. Almost rehearsed. Are you busy this weekend? I looked around my kitchen small. Clean. Quiet, the late afternoon sun slanting across the counter. Not really. I said. Why? Well, Sienna's parents are in town. They're visiting from New York. We'd love for you to meet them. Dinner on Saturday. At River North. 8 o'clock. He paused. Then added too quickly. It's a nice place. Mom, you might want to dress up a bit. Dress up. The words hit like a pinprick under the skin. Do they know anything about me? I asked. There was silence. I could almost hear him swallow. I told them you work in an office. That you live alone. That you're simple. That word again. Simple. You can live a whole life raising a man, giving him everything you had. And one day he'll describe you with a single word that feels like a bruise. Simple. I bit my tongue. All right, I said softly. I'll be there. He sounded relieved, too relieved. Thanks. Mom. It means a lot. When I hung up, I stood in the middle of my little living room for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. My apartment was clean but modest, second-hand furniture. Faded curtains. A television that still needed a remote with tape to hold the batteries in. To someone like Sienna's family, I probably looked like, well, someone who didn't matter. And that's when I decided, if my son and his in-laws wanted to meet a poor, plain, unremarkable woman, then that's exactly who they would meet. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was curious. Curious about how people like them, the Laurents, treated someone with nothing to offer. Because here's what Danny never knew. For the past 20 years, I've been the chief strategy officer for one of the largest logistics and tech corporations in North America. I oversee operations across 5 countries, manage billion-dollar budgets, and sign deals most people wouldn't understand without a team of lawyers. I make $38,000 a month, not counting stock options. But none of that has ever defined me. I grew up in a neighborhood where English was everyone's second language, where mothers worked 3 jobs and still came home smiling, where dignity wasn't about what you wore, it was about what you endured. So when I finally climbed my way up, I promised myself I'd never let money make me forget who I was. That's why my son never knew. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted him to grow up believing that character mattered more than income. That the kind of person you are when no one's watching says more than any salary ever could. But that Tuesday evening, after his call, something inside me cracked a little. I went to my closet, small, neat, full of memories, and stared at my clothes. Suits that could impress boardrooms, blouses from conferences, heels that had crossed continents. And then I reached past all of it and pulled out a plain gray dress, shapeless, a little wrinkled. The one I wore when I used to walk to my first job downtown. I held it up to the light. Perfect. On Saturday, I woke up early, made strong coffee, and opened the window. The wind off Lake Michigan was cold, clean, and sharp. I watched joggers passing below, young couples with lattes and golden retrievers, lives that seemed lighter than air. Mine had never been light, but it had been full of work, of lessons, of quiet victories no one ever clapped for. As I got ready, I looked at myself in the mirror, my hair streaked with gray, the lines around my mouth from too many late nights, The eyes that had seen everything: poverty, fear, success, love, betrayal, and still softened when I looked at my son. People underestimate mothers who look tired. They mistake silence for weakness. I tied my hair back, slipped on those old flats, picked up my faded tote bag, and took a long breath. Tonight, I thought, they'll see what they think they're seeing, and maybe I'll see who they really are. When my rideshare pulled up, the driver, a young man with music playing low, glanced at me through the mirror. "You headed to River North, yes?" I said. He nodded. "Big night," I smiled faintly. "Something like that." As the city passed by, glass towers catching the sunset, river shimmering gold, I felt two emotions battling in my chest: sadness and something sharper: sadness. Because my son felt he had to apologize for me. Sharpness. Because maybe this was the night I'd stop pretending to be smaller than I was. The driver dropped me in front of a high-rise restaurant glowing with warm light. Valet parking full of luxury cars. I stepped out into the evening wind. Women in silk dresses. Men in suits, laughter floating through the glass doors. I touched the hem of my old gray dress. Then I straightened my shoulders. "All right," I whispered. "Let's begin." And I walked inside. The restaurant's glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. And for a moment, I just stood there inside a world that didn't feel like it belonged to me. Golden lights shimmered on every surface. Jazz hummed through hidden speakers. Waiters glided like dancers, balancing crystal glasses that looked too fragile to hold. I clutched my old tote bag tighter. Its faded fabric looked almost gray-blue under the chandeliers, like an apology among diamonds. Then I saw them. At a long table near the windows overlooking the river sat my son, Danny. His back straight, his suit pressed, his smile forced. Beside him, Sienna, my daughter-in-law, elegant as always. And across from them, two people I recognized only from pictures: Vivienne and Gregory Laurent. Vivienne was the kind of woman you notice instantly, not because she was beautiful, but because she wanted you to know she was. Her dress shimmered with tiny sequins that caught the light every time she moved. Around her neck hung a gold chain heavy enough to weigh down her posture, but not her pride. Gregory sat beside her in a tailored gray jacket. Posture, military straight. Eyes sharp and cold. He looked like a man who'd never waited in line for anything. Danny saw me first. His expression froze just for a second before he quickly stood up. "Mom," he said, his voice thin, a little too cheerful. "You made it." "Of course," I replied softly. "I wouldn't miss it." Sienna gave me a polite kiss on the cheek, quick, like a reflex. Her perfume smelled expensive, but her eyes didn't meet mine for more than a second. "Mom, these are Sienna's parents, Vivienne and Gregory," Danny said, his tone already apologetic. "And this is my mother, Nora." Vivienne extended a hand, the kind of handshake that's more gesture than connection. "Pleasure," she said, her lips curling into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Nice to meet you," I said. Her gaze traveled slowly down my dress, my shoes, the old bag slung over my shoulder. In that brief silence, I could feel her assessment, the silent calculation of a woman who'd decided who I was before I even spoke. Gregory followed her lead. His handshake was firm but distant, the kind you'd give a bank teller. "Not family." "Welcome," he said simply. I smiled, timid on purpose, and sat at the empty chair, the one farthest from the head of the table. No one helped me pull it out. No one asked if I was comfortable. A waiter arrived with heavy menus printed in cursive. I opened mine and stared at the words foie gras, tartare, truffle risotto, pretending not to understand. Vivienne tilted her head. "Do you need help with the menu?" "Yes." "Please," I said quietly. "I'm not familiar with these things." She sighed almost theatrically. "Let's get you something simple," she said to the waiter. "Maybe the roasted chicken." It's safe. And not too pricey. The air froze. Danny looked down. Sienna fidgeted with her napkin. I kept my voice gentle. That sounds perfect. As the waiter walked away, Vivienne crossed her legs and smiled. You know, Nora, I admire women who live simply. There's a kind of humility to it. I nodded. Humility can be peaceful. She took a sip of her wine. Yes. Though peace is easier when you have comfort. Don't you think? Her husband chuckled. We worked hard for what we have. Vivienne manages our investments. And I oversee several real estate firms. It's a busy life. But rewarding. That's wonderful. I said. It is. Vivienne continued, leaning forward slightly. We've always believed in teaching Sienna to value success. We paid for her education, her travel, her wedding, everything she needed to have the best. That's what family does. She smiled again. Sweet, but sharp. And you? What do you do? Nora, I looked down, pretending to fumble with the napkin. Oh, just some office work. Paperwork. Mostly. Filing. Forms. Small things. Vivienne exchanged a quick glance with her husband. Ah! Administrative support. That's nice. Her tone was syrupy, sweet on the surface. Poison underneath. Dinner arrived, tiny portions arranged like artwork. Vivienne lifted her fork delicately. This steak is $75, she said casually. But it's worth every cent. You can't just eat anything. Right? I smiled faintly. Of course not. The conversation floated around me, vacations, business partners, property values. I just listened, letting every word sink like a stone into quiet water. Then Vivienne asked, So, Nora, you live alone? Correct, yes. It must be hard, she said, tilting her head with feigned sympathy. At your age, on a limited income. Danny shifted uncomfortably. Mom's always been independent, he said quickly. Vivienne nodded slowly. That's admirable. Still, I suppose Danny worries. He's such a caring son. We wouldn't want him to feel burdened. There it was. The first strike. Wrapped in velvet, I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. He has nothing to worry about. I get by. How brave, she said. Really. Not everyone can survive on so little. Sienna's hand tightened around her glass. Gregory looked amused. Vivienne kept going, as if she couldn't help herself. We've been fortunate. We travel often, Europe, Napa, the Caribbean. Just last month we were in Lake Tahoe. You'd love it there. Nora, the air, the view, the houses, though I suppose it's quite pricey. Maybe one day, I said. Her smile widened. Perhaps. Or maybe when we visit next time. You can come along. We'll cover your stay. Of course. A kindness that wasn't kindness at all. I nodded. You're very generous. She took another sip of her wine, looking satisfied. We try to help where we can. Family should lift each other up. Right. Right, I said softly. Danny glanced at me, a flicker of guilt in his eyes. I could almost hear the unspoken I'm sorry behind them. The waiter refilled glasses. The music played on, and I sat there, smiling gently, as I realized exactly what kind of night this was going to be. They weren't just testing me. They were measuring me against their money, their class, their idea of worth. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that they were the ones being tested. Not me. I looked at Vivienne, her laughter echoing above the clink of glassware. And I smiled quietly, because I already knew how this dinner would end. And it wouldn't end the way they expected. The waiter poured wine into Vivienne's glass, a deep, dark red that caught the light like blood. She swirled it slowly, admiring the color. This bottle's from Napa, she said. $380. One of our favorites. I smiled. That's quite something. She lifted her chin. When you've been around the world, you learn that quality always costs more. You can't cut corners in life. Nora, not with wine. Not with anything. I nodded. You're right. Her husband, Gregory, joined in. His tone casual but calculated. Vivienne has an excellent palate. She can tell the difference between a $5 bottle and a $500 one with one sip. Vivienne giggled softly, placing her manicured hand over his palm. You exaggerate. But she didn't deny it. The waiter offered me a glass. I shook my head politely. Just water. Please. Vivienne smiled that tight. Elegant smile people wear when they feel superior. Water's healthy, she said. And free. Danny's fork froze mid-air. His knuckles tightened around it. I pretended not to notice. The food came 3 bites of chicken on an oversized white plate. I ate quietly as they continued their parade of self-praise. Vivienne spoke about their lake property in Tahoe and condo in Miami. Gregory added, We just closed on a rental in Scottsdale. The market's incredible if you know what you're doing. Impressive, I said softly. Vivienne tilted her head. And you? Nora, do you rent or own your place I rent? I said. Her eyes lit up with something between pity and triumph. Oh, that must be difficult. You've been working so long, I would have thought, she trailed off, letting silence deliver the insult for her. I smiled faintly. I like simple things. They keep me grounded. Vivienne sighed dramatically. Yes, but at some point, you want comfort, don't you? I can't imagine being our age and still worrying about bills. Our age, I repeated. You're 58 too, she stiffened slightly. 53. She corrected quickly. Still young enough to travel. Thank God. I almost laughed. The mask of vanity was too fragile. Gregory cleared his throat. So, Nora, Danny mentioned you're still working. Ever thought of retiring? I shrugged. Work keeps me sharp. And company helps. Of course, he said, though I suppose after a lifetime of paperwork. It must be tiring. That one almost made me choke on my water. He said paperwork the way people say dust. Danny shifted in his seat again. His voice came out low. Warning. Dad. Vivienne cut him off. Honey, please. We're just having a nice family talk. She turned to me again. You must be proud of Danny. He's done so well. Sienna tells us he's finally earning 6 figures. That's quite an accomplishment. Don't you think I always knew he'd do fine? I said. Vivienne nodded. Yes. And of course, we helped where we could. The down payment on their condo, the honeymoon. You know how expensive starting out can be. Oh yes, I murmured. I imagine it adds up. It does, she said with mock sympathy. We just wanted them to have a head start. Everyone needs a little help. Her gaze lingered on me too long. Too deliberate. And then, almost sweetly, you were able to help Danny too. Weren't you? The table went silent. Even the soft jazz seemed to pause mid-note. I looked up slowly. Help him, yes, she said innocently. When they got married, you must have contributed something. A wedding gift. Perhaps I took a slow sip of water. A small one. From the heart. Vivienne smiled. All teeth and no warmth. That's sweet. Every little bit counts. Every little bit. The words sliced through me sharper than a knife. I could feel the blood rush in my ears. But I didn't let it reach my face. I'd been in boardrooms with men twice their arrogance and 10 times their cruelty. I'd learned the art of calm. I set my fork down gently. Yes, I said. Every little bit does count. Vivienne leaned back. Satisfied. Sipping her wine like a queen watching a subject bow. Sienna stayed silent. Her eyes darting between me and her mother. Her face was pale. Danny stared at his plate. His shame hung heavier than the chandeliers. I wanted to be angry, I really did. But what I felt instead was clarity. This dinner wasn't about family. It was a test of worth, a measurement in dollars and pride. And as I watched them talk about markets, travel, jewelry, something in me shifted. They thought I was small, invisible, replaceable, and that was their mistake. Vivian picked up her glass again. You know, I believe money doesn't change people. It only shows who they already were. I smiled. I couldn't agree more. Her eyes sparkled. Thinking she'd just delivered some grand truth, Gregory added. Exactly. We've seen people who can't handle success. They spend foolishly, dress badly, live beyond their means. It's sad. Really, very sad. Vivienne echoed. I looked at my reflection in the wine glass, the gray dress, the tired face, the calm eyes, and thought, they have no idea. The waiter brought dessert, a delicate slice of chocolate mousse with gold flakes on top. Vivienne gasped in delight. This is my favorite. $30 for a taste of heaven. You must try it. Nora, I'll pass, I said. Too sweet for me. Nonsense. Live a little, she said, laughing. You never know when you'll get to eat something like this again. Danny's head jerked up. Mom can have whatever she wants, he said sharply. Vivian's smile faded a little. Of course, dear. I didn't mean, but she did. She meant every word. I placed my napkin neatly on the table. Thank you, I said softly. This has been enlightening. Vivienne blinked. Oh, we're not finished yet. I wanted to discuss something important. Important? I asked. She folded her hands, her rings catching the light. Yes, it's about family responsibilities. Danny is such a good son, and I know he worries about you. We'd like to ease that concern. Gregory nodded, backing her up. Vivienne smiled sweetly, a smile that smelled like danger. We were thinking we could help you financially. Just a little. Maybe $800. $1,000 a month. So you can live comfortably. You wouldn't have to work so much. Danny could focus on his marriage without worry. The table froze. I felt my pulse in my throat, steady and cold. You'd do that, I asked quietly. Of course, she said. We're family. All we'd ask is that you give them space. Let them build their life together. Young couples need freedom. You understand. I looked at her for a long moment. The chandelier light gleamed on her diamonds. Her face glowed with self-satisfaction. Finally, I smiled. That's a generous offer. Vivienne, truly. Her eyes lit up, pleased. I'm so glad you see it that way. Oh, I do, I said softly, reaching for my glass of water. I just have one question. She tilted her head. Yes, how much? I asked. Is the going rate for a mother these days? The silence that followed my question could have cracked glass. Vivienne blinked once. I'm sorry, I looked at her gently. You offered to pay me to stay out of my son's life. So, I'm just curious, what's the current rate for a mother in your world? Is it a monthly plan or a one-time buyout? Her jaw stiffened. The faint pink of her cheeks darkened. Gregory cleared his throat, trying to smooth it over. Now, let's not make this dramatic. Nora. Vivienne was simply suggesting a little help, I heard her clearly. I said. My voice was calm, but the air around the table had changed sharp now, like ice. Vivienne's eyes darted to Sienna, then Danny, then back to me. You're twisting my words. I was offering kindness. Kindness doesn't usually come with a price tag, I said. The waiter arrived just then, setting down fresh silverware. Poor kid froze mid-step, sensing the tension like smoke. I gave him a small smile. We're fine. Thank you. When he left, Vivienne exhaled slowly. forcing a laugh. My goodness. We're misunderstanding each other. I'm only trying to make sure Danny doesn't feel pressured to support you. He's newly married. We want them to have peace. Danny flinched. His hand tightened around his glass. Mom. I raised a hand. It's all right. Sweetheart. Then I turned back to Vivienne. You think my son feels pressured by me? Her silence was answer enough. I folded my napkin neatly. The fabric crisp against my fingers. You know, Vivienne, when Danny was 10, I worked 3 jobs. I cleaned hotel rooms during the day, sold thrift clothes at night, and typed invoices until 2 in the morning. I never asked anyone for help. Not once. And I don't recall anyone offering. Her posture straightened, slightly defensive. That's admirable. Truly. But things change. We all have to adjust to reality. Reality, I repeated softly. What reality is that? The one where dignity is optional, her lips twitched. You're being emotional. I smiled. I'm being human. Across the table. Sienna's fork slipped from her hand and clattered onto her plate. The sound startled everyone. Her cheeks flushed. Sorry, she whispered. Vivienne seeked. Sweetheart. Relax. We're just having an adult conversation. Sienna didn't look at her mother, she looked at me. And for the first time that night, her eyes weren't cold or careful. They were guilty, maybe even ashamed. I met her gaze. Gentle but unflinching. You know, Sienna, I used to think I was protecting Danny by staying small, by letting him believe I didn't have much. I wanted him to understand that love isn't measured in dollars. Danny's eyes lifted. Uncertain. Vivienne scoffed softly. That's poetic. Nora. But love doesn't pay the bills. I leaned forward slightly. No. But it pays attention. And that's something money can't buy. Her mouth opened, then closed. Gregory muttered under his breath. Here we go. I smiled. You know, Gregory, you strike me as a man who values precision. So let's be precise. What exactly did you mean when you said you wanted to ease the concern? Was it about my son's happiness? Or your own comfort? He frowned. We don't need to explain ourselves. I think you just did, I said quietly. Danny's voice cracked through the tension. Mom, maybe we should know. Danny. I placed my hand over his. You've sat quietly long enough. But this isn't your burden to carry. It's mine. Vivienne leaned back, crossing her arms. You're making a scene. A scene, I repeated. I haven't even raised my voice. I gestured lightly to the glittering room around us. Trust me. Vivienne. I've seen scenes. This is Grace. The waiter passed again. Eyes darting nervously. The jazz music that once seemed soothing now pulsed like a slow heartbeat. I lowered my tone. You offered me money to disappear quietly. I'm not angry, honestly. I'm fascinated. Because offers like that don't come from generosity. They come from fear. Her eyes narrowed. Fear of what? Fear of being seen for who you really are. I said. That hit her. She blinked fast. Lips parting slightly, the mask slipping for half a second. Then she forced a laugh. High-pitched and brittle. This is absurd. You're reading too much into everything. You're not used to people trying to help you. Oh. I'm used to help. I said. Real help. The kind that asks nothing in return. I reached for my tote bag, placed it gently beside me, and smiled. Vivienne, you've built a beautiful empire of appearance. I respect that. But let me tell you something from experience. When people confuse control for kindness, they start buying people like they buy handbags until one of them refuses to be bought. Vivienne's face went pale. Are you implying? I'm saying, I interrupted softly, that I'm not for sale. Not for 1,000 a month. Not for 10,000. The table went dead quiet. Even the candles seemed to lean closer. Then Gregory snapped. Enough. This conversation's over. But it wasn't. Because for the first time all night, Danny looked at his wife, not with affection, but with realization. Did you know, he asked her quietly? Sienna's voice broke. I told her not to. Danny. I swear. I told her it was wrong. Vivian's head whipped toward her. Danny's chair scraped against the floor. Sienna's lips trembled. She said it would be better if you didn't have to worry about your mom so much. She thought it'd help us start fresh. He stared at her, then at me. Mom. I'm so sorry. I didn't know I reached out. Placing my hand over his trembling one. It's all right. Sweetheart. But it wasn't. Not really. And everyone at that table knew it. Vivienne grabbed her wine. Hands shaking slightly. This is getting ridiculous. We invited you here out of respect. Respect doesn't humiliate people. I said quietly. It protects them. Her throat tightened. But no words came out. I stood up slowly. My chair didn't scrape. My voice didn't shake. I've had enough for one evening. I said, but before I go, let me give you something to think about. I looked directly at Vivienne. You believe wealth gives you the power to decide who's worthy of love, but money doesn't make you rich. Vivienne, grace does. And tonight, you ran out of both. Her face hardened, but her eyes flickered fear, confusion, maybe even shame. I smiled gently. Have a lovely evening. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving behind their stunned faces, their untouched desserts, and the quiet crack of glass under too much pressure. But as I pushed through the doors into the cool Chicago night, I wasn't angry. I was awake. Because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the reckoning. When I stepped out of the restaurant, the Chicago night was cold and sharp. The kind of cold that slices through silk, but not through truth. The wind carried the faint echo of laughter from inside, brittle, empty, desperate. I kept walking until I reached the riverfront. The city lights shimmered on the water like scattered glass. And for the first time in years, I let the silence press against me. My son's voice still echoed in my head. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I knew he didn't. That's what hurt the most. He hadn't seen the strings pulling behind the curtain, the quiet manipulations, the gentle guilt, the way people like Vivienne disguised cruelty as care. I'd seen it before. In boardrooms, in men who thought power was their birthright, in women who smiled while sharpening knives made of words. But never, never in my own family. I sat on a bench overlooking the river, the metal freezing against my palms. My reflection trembled in the water-tired eyes. A soft face. The same gray dress that had absorbed every insult of the night like armor. For a long moment, I wondered if staying small had been my biggest mistake. When Danny was young, I'd promised myself I would never burden him with the weight of my past, the long climb, the sacrifices, the quiet empire I'd built. I wanted him to have love without fear, dreams without pressure. So I hid everything. I let him believe I was ordinary. I let the world believe it too. But tonight, I understood something new. Sometimes humility is mistaken for weakness, and when that happens, silence becomes complicity. My phone buzzed in my bag. A message from Danny. Danny, Mom. Please call me when you get home. I can't stop thinking about what happened. Danny, I'm sorry for everything. I'll fix it. I typed a simple reply, I'm fine. Sweetheart, go home. We'll talk tomorrow. Then I sat there a little longer, letting the cold clear my head. By the time I got home, it was past midnight. My apartment was still and dim. The city hum muffled through the windows. I took off my coat, hung it neatly, and walked to the desk in the corner of the living room. The desk was simple, but the documents inside its drawers were not. I unlocked the bottom one and pulled out a sleek leather folder. Inside were copies of contracts, board meeting notes, and my latest company letterhead, Lansford Logistics Corporation. My name, Nora Hale. Chief Strategy Officer gleamed in the corner of the letterhead in embossed silver. I stared at it for a moment. For 20 years, I'd helped men build their fortunes. I'd played invisible, the quiet strategist. The problem solver who didn't need applause. But invisibility only protects you until someone mistakes it for your identity. And tonight, Vivienne Laurent had done exactly that. I opened my laptop and began typing an email. Not to her. Not yet. To the restaurant. To whom it may concern. Thank you for hosting our family dinner this evening. Unfortunately, the experience was unacceptable due to a violation of professional courtesy and potential harassment at the venue. I would like a record of the event from your security footage between 7:45 and 9:10 p.m., particularly our table near the west window. I hit send. Not because I wanted revenge, not yet, but because I wanted evidence. Then I wrote another email. This time to my company's communications department. Please reserve conference room B for a client introduction breakfast next Friday. 8 guests total. Hosted by Nora Hale. I paused. My reflection in the screen looked tired. But the eyes, those eyes were alive again. Because I knew exactly who I would invite. 3 days later, Danny showed up at my apartment early in the morning. He looked wrecked, hair messy. Dark circles under his eyes. Like he hadn't slept since that night. "Mom," he said. Voice rough. "I can't believe what she said to you." I tried to talk to Sienna. But her mother keeps interfering. She says I'm overreacting. I poured him coffee. Calm as ever. "Sit down. Honey." He did. His hands shook around the mug. "She offered you money," he said. Still in disbelief. "Like you're some charity case." "Who does that? People who confuse love with ownership," I said simply. "And people who've never been told no." He stared at me. I don't know what to do. Sienna's torn. Her mom's furious. And I feel like I failed you. I reached out, touching his hand. "You didn't fail me. Danny, you just learned something painful about the world. And about the people you let too close." He dropped his gaze. "I wish I could make it right." "You will," I said. "But not yet. Not with words." He frowned. "What do you mean?" I smiled softly. "Let me handle it." He looked uncertain. But there was something in my tone, something he hadn't heard before that made him nod slowly. "Okay," he said finally. "Just promise me you won't let them hurt you again." I met his eyes. "Oh, sweetheart. That part's over. That Friday." The conference room on the 40th floor of Lansford Logistics shimmered with morning light. The long glass windows reflected the skyline, the city waking below. A silver tray of croissants sat beside crystal carafes of coffee. Name cards lined the table. At the head, Nora Hale. Beside it, Vivienne and Gregory Laurent. The invitation had come through a mutual contact, a business opportunity. As my assistant phrased it, I knew Vivienne wouldn't resist. Power always answers when it thinks it's being called. At 9:02 sharp, they arrived perfectly dressed, perfectly confident. Vivienne's eyes flicked around the room. And when she saw me standing by the window, her face froze. "You," she breathed. I smiled warmly. "Good morning." "Vivienne." "Gregory." Gregory blinked. What is this? Business?" I said, "You said you value precision. So do I." I gestured toward the table. "Please. Have a seat." They hesitated. But curiosity and pride won. I let the silence stretch. Let the city hum beneath us. Let them feel the altitude 40 floors up, where truth has nowhere to hide. Then, I slid a folder toward them. "Before we begin, I wanted to formally introduce myself. Nora Hale, Chief Strategy Officer, Lansford Logistics Corporation." Vivienne's face drained of color. Gregory blinked, his mouth half open. You're yes, I said gently. Not a secretary. Not a burden. Not someone you can buy off with a monthly allowance. I smiled. Calm and almost kind. I'm the woman who signs half the contracts that fund your company's shipping accounts. Vivian's lips parted soundless. Gregory reached for the folder with trembling hands, and that's when I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Because justice, when it's quiet and precise, doesn't need rage. It just needs timing. Vivian's diamond bracelet glinted under the soft morning light as her fingers gripped the folder I'd just slid across the conference table. She didn't open it at first. She just stared at my name printed on the embossed cover, Nora Hale. Chief Strategy Officer. Gregory looked between us, his jaw twitching. This must be a mistake. I smiled. No mistake. That's my title. I've held it for 11 years. Vivian blinked hard, as if her brain were trying to reboot. You're a corporate executive. I am, I said simply. And as of this quarter, I oversee over 10,000 employees across 6 states, including, coincidentally, the logistics contract your investment company holds with us. A sharp silence fell. Gregory's face drained. His hand fell from the folder as if it had burned him. Your company handles our distribution. I finished for him. Yes. You signed a 3-year partnership with us last spring, which means, I said, folding my hands calmly. You report directly to one of my regional managers. Vivian's lips parted slightly. This is some kind of game. Games are for people who have time to waste. I said. I prefer clarity. The glass walls of the conference room framed the Chicago skyline behind me, sharp, clean, and mercilessly bright. The morning light reflected off the table, cutting across Vivian's face like a spotlight. Now, I said softly, shall we talk business? You mentioned wanting to help me financially. Wasn't it? Vivian's cheeks flushed pink. That was a misunderstanding. Oh, I understood perfectly. I said, you offered me $800 a month to stay out of my son's life. I just wanted to make sure that generosity extended to your business relationships, too. Because if that's how you negotiate, I'd advise revisiting your PR strategy. Gregory's throat made a sound halfway between a cough and a groan. Nora, please. Let's be reasonable. Whatever happened at dinner, let's leave it in the past. I nodded thoughtfully. I intend to. But you see, there's a problem. You and your wife didn't just humiliate me privately. You did it publicly in a high-end restaurant full of witnesses. I slid another envelope across the table. Security footage. I said. From that night, I requested it. Vivian froze. It captured every comment, every insult, every offer to pay me off. I continued. I don't plan to release it unless I have to. But I think you should know it exists. Her breathing quickened. I wouldn't need to. I said, because the damage was already done. To you. She blinked rapidly, trying to regain her composure. What do you want from us? The question was small. Defensive. The sound of a woman who'd spent her whole life controlling situations, suddenly realizing she wasn't in control anymore. What I want, I said slowly, is simple. Respect. The same respect you demand, yet refuse to give. Gregory rubbed his temples. You invited us here just to humiliate us. I tilted my head. Didn't you invite me to dinner for the same reason? He looked away. Vivian's voice cracked. Why are you doing this? We didn't know who you were. If we'd known, I smiled sadly. That's exactly my point. Vivienne, you shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with decency. She looked down at the folder again, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside were company reports, press clippings, and an article titled The Woman Behind the Quiet Rise of Lansford Logistics. Her eyes moved across the lines, a single mother who worked her way from secretary to executive. Known for her humility, efficiency, and discretion. She swallowed hard. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes, something dangerously close to remorse. But it vanished just as quickly, replaced by pride. Vivienne straightened, forcing a brittle smile. Fine. You made your point. You're powerful. Congratulations. Does that make you feel better? No, I said softly. It makes me sad. She frowned. Sad, yes, I said, because you could have had a daughter-in-law who admired you, a family that truly accepted you. But you were too busy counting worth in dollars to notice the human being sitting across from you. The door opened quietly. My assistant, Claire, peeked in. Miss Hale, your 930 guests are here. Perfect timing, I said. Send them in. 2 men entered, both wearing tailored suits. One of them extended a hand to Gregory. Mr. Self, Laurent. We spoke over email. I'm Ethan Price, VP of Partnerships. Gregory blinked. Yes. Of course, wait. You're from Lansford's Acquisitions Department, Ethan said pleasantly. We've been reviewing your accounts for a compliance audit. Ms. Hale wanted to introduce us personally. Gregory's color drained again. Vivienne turned to me. You're auditing us, I smiled gently. Standard procedure. I just thought it'd be efficient to start with clients I already know. Her voice broke into a whisper. You're punishing us. No. Vivienne, I said. I'm teaching you. She pressed her lips together, her breathing shallow. I didn't come here to destroy you, I said quietly. I came here to show you what real power looks like. It's not about revenge or control or appearances. It's about integrity. It's about standing up when someone tries to make you small and saying, no more. Vivienne's eyes shimmered. Maybe anger. Maybe shame. Maybe both. Gregory muttered. We'll cooperate fully. I know you will, I said. I stood, gathering my notes. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you for your time. As they rose to leave, Vivienne paused at the door. Her voice was almost a whisper. I misjudged you. I met her gaze. Yes, you did. She swallowed. And now, I said softly. You get to decide who you want to be after that mistake. She nodded once stiffly and walked out. When the door closed, I exhaled slowly. My reflection in the glass wall looked calm. But inside I was shaking, not from fear, but from release. For 20 years, I'd lived quietly. I'd built, led, succeeded, all without fanfare. But today, for the first time, I hadn't hidden, and it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like justice, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't scream but echoes. That night, my phone buzzed. A message from Sienna. Sienna, I heard about the meeting. My parents told me everything. I don't know what to say. I typed slowly. You don't need to say anything. Just learn. A few seconds later, Sienna, I want it. Can we meet? I hesitated, then replied, yes, tomorrow. Because justice wasn't the end of the story. It was just the start of change. And sometimes, to heal a family, you have to burn through the lies first. It was Saturday morning when I heard the knock on my door. 3 gentle taps, hesitant, respectful, like someone unsure if they had the right to ask for forgiveness. When I opened it, Sienna was standing there. She didn't look like the woman from the restaurant. No perfect curls, no shimmering dress, no jewelry to announce her worth, just jeans, a beige sweater, hair tied back, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. Hi, she said softly. May I come in? I nodded and stepped aside. Of course. She entered slowly, taking in my apartment as if she were seeing it for the first time. The small living room, the books stacked on the coffee table, the framed photos of Danny from his high school graduation, from the day he got his first job, from our old backyard where we used to plant tomatoes in cheap pots. It's cozy, she whispered. Peaceful. It's mine, I said simply. She smiled faintly and sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Only the soft ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. Then she took a deep breath. I don't know where to start. Start where it hurts, I said. That's usually the truth. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. When you walked into that restaurant, I felt ashamed. I didn't interrupt her. Not because of you, she continued, her voice trembling. Because I realized what I had become. I saw my mother's face when she looked at you, the same face she used to give waitresses, store clerks, housekeepers. The face that says you're beneath me, and I did nothing. Her words cracked halfway through the sentence. I sat quietly, letting her speak. I've been raised my whole life to measure people by what they owned, she said. If someone didn't wear designer, if they didn't vacation in the right places, my parents called them failures, and I believed them. I thought that was normal. She looked up, eyes wet. But that night, when you spoke to my mother, when you revealed who you are, I realized how small we all were. How empty. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I wanted to disappear. I handed her a tissue. Disappearing won't fix it, I said gently. Facing it will. She nodded, wiping her eyes. My mother is furious. My father won't talk about it. They say you set them up. I smiled faintly. Of course they do. It's easier to call it a trap than admit it was a mirror. Her lips trembled. You didn't just humiliate them. You broke something in them. And yet, I think it needed to break. I leaned back. Sienna, I didn't do it to destroy them. I did it to protect myself and my son. But the truth has a way of spreading further than we intend. She looked at me earnestly. I needed that truth. Too. There was a long pause. She took another breath and said, I came to apologize. You already did. I said softly. No, she insisted. Not properly. I need to say this. She straightened, her voice trembling but clear. I'm sorry for judging you. For assuming Danny's mother was someone to be embarrassed about. For staying silent when my parents disrespected you. I was complicit. And I'll carry that shame for a long time. Her honesty hung heavy in the air. I studied her face, young, beautiful, but fragile in a way I hadn't noticed before. The same fragility I'd seen in myself decades ago. When I was still learning that silence isn't kindness, I took a slow breath. Apology accepted. Her eyes widened slightly. Surprised, but understand something. I continued. Forgiveness isn't a reset button. It doesn't erase what happened. It just means I'm choosing peace over poison. She nodded slowly. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not yet. I said, but you're earning it right now by owning what you did. We sat there for a moment, letting the words breathe. Then she asked quietly, how did you do it? How did you become you after everything? How did you not turn bitter? I smiled. A little sadly. Because bitterness is expensive. Sweetheart, it costs peace. And I couldn't afford to lose that. She leaned forward, listening like a student at the feet of a teacher. I worked. Sienna, I said. I worked when I was tired. When I was scared. When I was invisible. I didn't climb for wealth. I climbed for freedom, the freedom to never be at the mercy of people like your parents. But I also learned that money without integrity is just noise. The real currency is self-respect. Sienna's voice cracked. I want to learn that. I don't want to be like them. Then don't. I said. You get to choose. She looked down. They won't forgive me for standing up to them. My mother said I embarrassed the family. I tilted my head. Maybe it's time to decide which family you're protecting, the one you were born into, or the one you're building. Her eyes filled again. But this time the tears didn't fall. Danny's been patient, she whispered. He says he still loves me, but he doesn't trust me yet. I don't blame him. Trust, I said, isn't built with promises. It's built with patterns. She nodded. Then, almost shyly, she reached into her purse and took out a folded envelope. She placed it on the table. This is from my parents. They asked me to give it to you. I raised an eyebrow. What is it? An apology letter? She said bitterly. Well, that's what they call it. It's mostly excuses. I didn't touch it. Then leave it unopened. Some words aren't worth hearing twice. She looked at me and then, for the first time, she smiled. Not the practiced, politest smile I'd seen before. A real one, small, raw, human. You know, she said softly. Danny told me once that you were the strongest woman he'd ever met, that you didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I didn't understand what he meant until now. I chuckled lightly. He's exaggerating. I have my flaws. But you also have grace, she said, and that's something my parents never taught me. I looked at her, this young woman who'd walked into my life wearing pride like armor, and now sat before me stripped of it, trying to rebuild herself from the inside out. You can still learn, I said gently. Grace isn't something you inherit. It's something you practice. She nodded. Will you help me? Only if you help yourself first, I said. She smiled again, stronger this time. When she left that morning, I stood by the window and watched her walk away. Her steps were slow, but steady. And for the first time since that disastrous dinner, I felt something shift. Not revenge, not triumph, but healing, the quiet kind. The kind that begins when someone finally looks in the mirror and chooses to change. That night, Danny called. His voice was soft. I'm hopeful. Mom, Sienna told me she came to see you. She did, I said. And she's learning, I replied. He exhaled with relief. Thank you. For giving her a chance. For giving us a chance. I'm not giving chances, I said. I'm giving lessons. What you do with them, that's on you. He laughed quietly. You sound like a professor. I sound like a mother, I said. Same thing. When we hung up, I looked around my little apartment, same quiet space, same modest furniture. But it felt different now. Lighter. Because forgiveness, I realized, doesn't change the past. It redeems the future. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt wide open. The following week, my apartment felt unusually quiet. Not the kind of silence that hurts, but the kind that means something has settled. Danny came by on a Sunday afternoon, carrying a paper bag that smelled like his favorite barbecue place. He used to bring food like this when he was in college, just to have an excuse to visit. It made me smile. Peace offering, I teased, taking the bag from his hands. He grinned. Boyish again. You deserve a meal that doesn't come with emotional drama. I laughed softly. Then you might have brought the wrong sauce. We ate at the little dining table by the window, no music, no background noise, just the two of us and the soft buzz of city life outside. After a few bites, Danny sighed. Mom, I've been thinking about what you said, about patterns. Not promises. I looked up, and he hesitated. I think I finally understand what it means to build boundaries. Not walls. I leaned back. That's a good start. What brought you to that, Sienna? He said quietly. She's trying. Mom, she's been different since your talk. She even told her parents we won't accept their money anymore, that we'll live off what we earn, not their gifts. I nodded slowly, proud but cautious. That's a big step. He took a deep breath. Yeah, but now they're furious. My father-in-law froze the trust fund he set up for her. Vivienne said we're being ungrateful. Let them, I said. He blinked. That's it, I repeated. If they use money to control, Then, starving their control is the only way to set them free. And you too. Danny stared at me for a long moment. You make it sound so easy. It's not, I said. It's hard. Because boundaries feel cruel to people who've benefited from your lack of them. He nodded slowly, letting that sink in. Mom, he said. I feel guilty cutting them off. I mean, they're still Sienna's parents. Guilt is the leash that manipulative people use. I said softly. You can love them from a distance. You can wish them well, but you don't have to hand them the keys to your peace. He looked down. Thoughtful. Sienna said something similar. She said she finally understands why you live the way you do, Simple. Quiet. Detached from the show. I smiled faintly. I live that way because simplicity isn't a lack of ambition. It's a declaration I don't owe anyone a performance. He smiled. Half in admiration, half in awe. You always make it sound poetic. It's not poetry. I said, it's survival. Later that week, Sienna called me. Her voice was softer now, but steady. Can I take you to lunch? Just the two of us. Of course, I said. We met at a small cafe near Lincoln Park, the kind of place where people write novels, no one reads, and talk about dreams instead of stocks. When she arrived, she looked lighter, not glamorous, but radiant in a quiet way. I wanted to thank you, she said, stirring her tea, for not giving up on me or on Danny. I didn't do it for you, I said kindly. I did it because the next generation deserves better than what we had. She nodded slowly. I've been thinking a lot about that word you used, boundaries. It used to sound cold to me, like a wall, but now it feels like a door, one I can finally close when someone tries to walk all over me. I smiled. That's exactly what it is. A door with a lock you control. She took a deep breath. My parents hate it. They've been calling every day, trying to guilt-trip me into dinner. I haven't answered. That's okay, I said. They'll scream first, then go silent. Silence is where you'll find your power. Her eyes filled with tears. I keep wondering if they'll ever change. I looked at her gently. Maybe. But don't waste your life waiting for them to realize what they did wrong. Some people only wake up when they lose everything worth keeping. She swallowed hard. Like you and Danny. Exactly, I said. Sometimes, love needs distance to stay alive. A few days later, Danny and Sienna invited me to dinner at their apartment. It wasn't fancy takeout boxes on the kitchen counter, mismatched plates, a candle that smelled like vanilla and courage. They decorated one wall with photos, their wedding, their travels, a new picture of the three of us at the park. For the first time, I felt something shift in their space. It wasn't wealth. It was warmth. Mom, Danny said after dinner, we want to talk to you about something. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds serious. Sienna smiled nervously. It's good, serious. We've been talking about the future and we realized we want to do things differently. We want to build a home that feels like this one. Simple. Honest. Free. I smiled. That sounds perfect. Danny reached across the table, taking Sienna's hand. We also decided that when we have kids someday, we'll teach them about dignity. Not just success. Sienna nodded. And when they ask about you, I'll tell them about the woman who taught us that wealth is silent and arrogance is loud. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I held them back. That's all I ever wanted. I said softly, not to be remembered for money, but for meaning. When I got home that night, the city was glowing, windows lit like tiny confessions scattered across the skyline. I stood at my window, sipping tea, thinking about how boundaries change everything. They don't push people away. They show them where you end and where they begin. I used to think protecting peace meant staying small. But now I knew better. Protecting peace means standing tall quietly, firmly, without apology. My phone buzzed. A message from Sienna. Thank you for teaching me that love can exist without control. I smiled. Then another message came from an unknown number. This is Vivienne. I need to see you. I stared at it for a long moment. Old instinct told me to ignore it. But something deeper whispered that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't finished yet. I typed a single reply. Tomorrow. Noon. Same cafe. And as I put the phone down, I realized something profound. Boundaries don't just protect you from others. They also give others one last chance to cross the line respectfully. Because sometimes, redemption needs an open door. But only if the person knocking finally understands what it means to ask before entering. The next day, the sky hung low over Chicago, gray and heavy, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I arrived at the cafe 10 minutes early, same corner table. The same view of the park, where the leaves were just starting to turn amber. I didn't order anything yet. I just sat, hands wrapped around the lukewarm ceramic mug, listening to the faint hum of life around me, a mother laughing with her toddler, a man typing on his laptop, a couple arguing softly about sugar packets. Then the door opened. Vivienne stepped inside. She wasn't wearing her usual armor, no sequined dress, no diamond necklace, no expensive confidence, just a beige coat, black pants, hair tied back simply. But the fatigue on her face wasn't from lack of sleep. It was from pride collapsing under its own weight. When she saw me, she hesitated. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked unsure of her place in the world. Hi, she said quietly. Vivienne. I greeted, gesturing to the seat across from me. Sit. She obeyed, carefully setting her purse down like she was laying a burden to rest. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she exhaled. I almost didn't come. I know, I said. But you did. She looked down at her hands, the manicured nails now bare. I wasn't sure what to say. Try honesty, I said gently. It's lighter to carry. Her lips twitched, almost a smile. Then she nodded. Fair enough. She sat back, her gaze steady but fragile. After the meeting at your office, I couldn't sleep for days. I kept replaying everything. The dinner. The things I said. The things I didn't say. I waited. My husband's furious. She continued. He says you humiliated us. He says you planned it all. Did I? I asked softly. Her eyes flickered. Maybe. But that's not what bothers me. What bothers me is, you were right. I said nothing. I built my whole life around being somebody, she said. The house. The travel. The charity galas. I told myself it was about security, about never going back to the poverty I grew up in. But it wasn't that. It was about control. About fear. Her voice cracked. And I turned that fear into arrogance. I hurt people to hide from the girl I used to be, the one who didn't have enough. Her confession hung between us. Heavy but honest. I'm not proud of who I've become, she whispered. I used to think people respected me. Now I realize they just tolerated me. I leaned forward slightly. That realization doesn't destroy you, Vivienne. It rebuilds you if you let it. She blinked fast, tears threatening but not falling. Do you hate me? I smiled softly. No. I pity you. And I pray for you. Her brow furrowed. Why would you pray for me after everything I said? Because you were never my enemy, I said. You were my lesson. She covered her mouth, a small sob escaping before she could stop it. When she spoke again, her voice was raw. I've lost my daughter's trust. She won't answer my calls. Gregory says to give her time, but I know the look in her eyes. She's done with me. And it's my fault. I nodded slowly. Maybe. But losing people isn't always punishment. Vivienne, sometimes it's mercy, a chance to learn who you are when there's no one left to impress. Her gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw something new: humility. Not the forced kind, The real kind that comes only after a person's pride has starved itself to death. I came here because I wanted to understand you, she said. The night at the restaurant, you were calm. Even when I was cruel. You didn't shout. You didn't defend yourself. You just watched. How I smiled faintly. Because I didn't need to win. I just needed to see. See what? The truth? I said simply. About you. About me. About my son. That dinner wasn't a punishment. Vivienne. It was a mirror. She stared at me for a long time, her jaw trembling slightly. You saw a monster. I saw a scared woman pretending to be untouchable. I corrected. And believe me, I know what that feels like. I used to be her. Too. Her eyes widened. I nodded. When I first started working, I used to wear fake pearls to look professional. I lied about my address to seem middle class. I thought success meant hiding where I came from. Until one day, I realized that the people worth keeping never cared about that. Only the ones who wanted to use me did. She listened. Quiet. Almost reverent. I spent decades earning power. I said, but I only found peace when I stopped needing it to feel seen. Vivienne whispered. I don't know if I can do that. You can. I said, but it's a process. First, you face the mirror. Then, you forgive the reflection. Her tears finally spilled. I don't know how to make things right with Sienna. I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. Start by apologizing without explaining. Don't justify. Don't excuse. Just tell her you were wrong and that you'll do better not to earn forgiveness, but to deserve it. She squeezed my hand gently. Do you think she'll listen? She will. I said, but only when your apology stops being a performance. Vivienne nodded slowly, wiping her cheeks. I think I needed to hear that from you. I smiled softly. You needed to hear it from yourself. She exhaled. A long, trembling sigh that sounded like the first breath of a different woman. After a long silence, she looked at me again. Nora, I want to thank you. For what? For not letting me stay blind. I shook my head. Don't thank me. Thank the moment that broke you. It's doing the real work. She laughed through the tears, a tired, honest laugh. You always have the last word. Don't you? Only when the truth's too quiet. I said. We finished our tea in silence. She stood to leave, then paused. If you ever need anything, I smiled. You won't have to offer money this time. Right. Her laugh was small but real. No. Just respect. That's all I ever wanted. She nodded once, then walked out. I watched her cross the street, shoulders straighter, steps slower, like someone learning how to walk without heels for the first time in her life. That night, I wrote in my journal something I hadn't done in years. Today, I met the woman who once tried to buy my silence. She came to apologize. And somehow, I realized she wasn't just my adversary, she was the mirror I didn't know I needed. We both built walls made of fear, just painted in different colors. But maybe, at the end of it all, forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about understanding that even the people who hurt you were fighting their own invisible wars. I closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and looked out the window. The city was glowing again, not cold and metallic like before, but warm, forgiving, human. For the first time, I didn't feel like the woman who had to pretend to be poor or powerful. I was just Nora whole, unhidden, unafraid. A few weeks passed. The leaves in Lincoln Park had turned completely golden by the time life began to feel normal again, or maybe a new kind of normal. Danny and Sienna invited me over for Sunday brunch. Their apartment smelled like pancakes and cinnamon. Sunlight spilling across the floor in perfect rectangles. Sienna was at the stove, wearing an apron that said, "Perfectly imperfect." When she turned around, she looked genuinely happy, no tension. No careful politeness. Just warmth. Coffee, she asked. Always. I said. Danny was setting the table, humming softly, his shoulders finally free of the tightness he'd carried for months. I could tell he was at peace. That was enough for me. When we sat down, Leo, their golden retriever puppy, came running out of the bedroom, wagging his tail like he'd been waiting for me all morning. Sienna laughed. He waits by the door every Sunday. I think he knows you bring the good treats. I smiled, reaching down to scratch the dog's head. He's got good instincts. For a while, we just ate and talked about work. About the little things that make life whole again. No heavy subjects. No old ghosts. Just peace. Then, after a quiet moment, Sienna looked up and said softly, "Mom, I talked to her." "Your mother?" I asked. She nodded. "We met last week. At the park, she cried the whole time. And you?" I cried too, she said, voice trembling. But I didn't cry for the past. I cried because I finally forgave her. Not because she deserved it, but because I was tired of carrying her mistakes in my heart. My throat tightened. "That's how you know you're growing," I said. "When forgiveness feels like freedom, not surrender." Sienna nodded. She asked me how you were. I smiled faintly. "Tell her I'm still teaching lessons no one asked for." We laughed, the kind of laughter that only comes after too many tears. Then Danny reached across the table, placing his hand over Sienna's. "Mom, I don't think I've ever said it properly. Thank you for what I asked, for saving us," he said. "Not from Ava, not from my in-laws, but from ourselves. You taught us what real wealth looks like." I looked at my son, this man who used to hide behind ambition. Now, sitting here as someone who finally understood that love doesn't need a show. "Danny," I said softly, "I didn't save you. You just finally stopped running from the truth." He smiled, eyes wet. "Still sounds like something you'd call saving." I laughed quietly, shaking my head. "Maybe. But remember, this life doesn't reward the loudest. It rewards the honest." That afternoon, after they left for a walk, I stayed behind for a while. The apartment was warm, the kind of quiet that carries love in it. I wandered over to the window, looking out at the street where people passed by, couples holding hands, a child tugging his father's coat, a girl on a bike with her scarf fluttering like a flag of freedom. And I thought about everything that had happened, about Vivienne, about the dinner, the shame, the silence, and finally, the peace. It's strange, isn't it, how one cruel dinner can destroy a lie, but also build a bridge. I used to believe revenge was closure, that proving people wrong would heal the parts of me they tried to break, but I was wrong. Closure doesn't come when they apologize. It comes when you no longer need them to. That's what I learned. Later that week, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name written in careful, elegant cursive. Inside was a single page. "Nora, you were right. I was blind, but I'm learning to see. Thank you for showing me the mirror, even when it hurt. Vivienne." I folded the letter and placed it in my journal, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even the hardest hearts can still soften. That night, I sat by the window again, a cup of tea in hand, thinking of Maria, my late husband. The years I raised Danny alone. The nights I ate cold leftovers because the bills were higher than my paycheck. Every scar had built this version of me, the one who no longer hides her worth behind price tags or pity. And I realized something. All those years I spent chasing stability. I was really chasing respect. But respect can't be bought, borrowed, or begged for. It's earned in silence, through integrity. That's the legacy I wanted to leave behind. Not money, not reputation, but the courage to live without fear of being less than. Before going to bed, I recorded a message for the small podcast I'd started, the one my friends convinced me to make after my story went viral. My voice was calm, but steady tonight. I want to talk about something simple, I said. Boundaries and grace. People think those two things don't belong together, that if you forgive someone, you have to let them back in. But that's not true. You can love people and still keep your peace. You can forgive and still close the door. Forgiveness is not an invitation. It's a release. And wealth, real wealth, isn't what's in your bank. It's how calm your heart is when you're finally done proving your worth. I paused, smiling at the microphone. So if you're listening to this, wherever you are, maybe at your kitchen table, or driving home after a long day, I hope you remember this. You're not defined by who hurt you or who underestimated you. You're defined by who you became after. I turned off the recorder and sat in the quiet for a moment. The city outside was alive, sirens, laughter, footsteps. But inside, there was only stillness, the kind that doesn't ask for more. The next morning, Sienna texted me a photo she and Danny, standing in front of a small old house with a sold sign in the yard. Our first home, she wrote. No help. Just us. I smiled so wide it hurt. Proud of you. I texted back. Keep building peace. Not castles. She replied with a heart emoji. I walked out onto my balcony, feeling the chill of the autumn air. Down below, a little boy was helping his grandmother carry groceries. He couldn't have been older than 7, but he looked so proud, like he was carrying the world. And I thought maybe he was. Because that's what we do. Every generation carries a little more wisdom, a little more grace. Hoping to make the next one lighter, I closed my eyes and whispered to the wind. Let them learn earlier than we did. Then I turned back inside, poured myself another cup of tea, and smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to fight for, only things to cherish. And that, I realized, is the quiet luxury no one can take away.